Do you come to Chicago a lot?
I don't. Not because I'm avoiding Chicago.
Okay.
I haven't had much reason to visit.
Let's fix that.
Okay.
Well, you were going to read a little bit from your book to start us off, Dear Mr. You. Which one were you thinking? We were still deciding.
I know, it was a little bit hard. What's hard is, I think essentially I really, as I've said to you before, I really wanted to write a very positive book, and I didn't want to sort of delve into my experiences with the gender, with the opposite gender, and have it be like finger wagging, or so. I wanted it to be a celebration of the male, right? And I've known so many heroic men, and I have a son, and I wanted it to be a positive thing. And then for some reason, we were like, which one should we do? And we only picked the two that are slightly...
The bad boyfriends.
Well, the one where I stabbed the guy, because he eats my guacamole. And so,
I mean, had it coming, yeah. I'd say on that.
Yeah, but he was not a bad guy at all. He was a very good guy.
How was the guacamole, though?
Well, it was mine.
Oh.
And the problem was that I assert later in the piece, because there's no way I can read all of it, he had an entire portion of guacamole himself on his combo plate. And we sat down and he ate all of mine. All of it. And I'd just gotten a second-degree burn, and anyway, I can read some of it.
Yeah, I think if you read it, it'll tell the story.
But essentially, I did want this to be, and I can say with assurance that, the book I did embark on it with a completely positive spirit and whatever. And I did happen to stab this guy with a fork, but...
Sure. We'll talk about the positive.
It
we'll
wasn't
balance
like a flesh wound. It was just, a little like... I'm sure he's fine now. Okay. Thank you, Nikki. Okay. Dear former boyfriend, in July, we kissed until our lips were swollen, but by April, I was giving dumb answers to your questions, and we were fighting until we forgot our points. I don't remember having a single reasonable point, and you did. You had sound ones. I didn't know how to have an adult discussion, which I know was frustrating. I was frustrating, no denying it. But what was your point that weekend that we argued all day and forgot to eat? We kept at it until we grew weak and unfocused, when finally you said, "This is insanity, you're killing me, I want Mexican, let's go." I said, "Yes, down with insanity, I just need shoes," and you said, "Okay, but hear me when I say there is now a hole inside me that only salsa can fill." We made it outside into daylight, which was an adjustment, got onto your Harley, and you yelled, "Let's go to that place in Malibu." And I shouted back, "Sounds great, but I think I just burned my leg on your exhaust pipe." You said, "Oh, I'm sure they'll have Neosporin at the bar." We drove up the coast and pulled in, jumping off your bike and heading for the entrance, but the door was locked and the place was closed. You walked back to the bike and put your head in your hands, taking a deep breath and trying to fathom the unfairness of life. Kind of how I imagine Moses looked when Pharaoh's magicians kept coldly one-upping him every time he thought he'd nailed it by turning an umbrella into a boa constrictor. Or how disappointed Mel Gibson looked on that poster for Braveheart. I put my hand on your back and said, "Sorry, babe, I know you're starving." You said, voice cracking from the memory, that you'd had only half a Pop-Tart and an Amstel Light 23 hours ago, and now you felt like an outlaw. I said, "Wow." I said, "Don't cry." You said, "I'm not crying, goddammit." You gunned out of the parking lot, grunting something that sounded like strip mall. We rode another 20 minutes before pulling up to another restaurant as it was closing, and when you realized the gruesome reality that they wouldn't stay open, you threw your helmet into the gravel and raised a fist to the gods. "I'm starving," you bellowed. "I could eat my bike. I need chips like I need oxygen, my kingdom for a chimichanga." I started to space out to avoid agitating you further, and we got back on your bike and you roared, "On to that dive downtown." I raced to put my helmet back on, but in my rush, it ended up backwards on my face like Ichabod Crane, and I was suddenly blind and could not breathe except for one eye hole that had landed near an open nasal passage. I didn't realign it for fear of being thrown from your Harley, and I tried squeezing you and yelling over the wail of your bike that I needed air, but you thought I was being comforting and called out not to worry, the next place would have your combo plate or you would decapitate someone.
I mean, that makes the stabbing seem all the more justified.
Well, it gets worse.
Yeah, it gets worse.
Yeah.
Well, it does make me want to ask you about the epistolary form, the letter. When did you strike on that, and why? I'm going to have my guesses, but.
Well, I had written for Esquire for a number of years, and I really, really loved it. And there was one occasion where my editor there called me and said, "We want you to," and they'd done this before, but for some reason it felt much more general this day. He said, "We want you to write about men." And I was like, "Well, like anything in particular about them?" Or, and he said, "No, just something." I said, "That's a bit broad, you know?" And he said, "No," and he said, "This is your word count." And he said, "No finger wagging." And I was like, "I'm not a finger wagger. Like, who loves men more than me?" And I said, I don't know how I'm going to do this. That seems, he said, and I need it by, something ridiculous, like next Thursday or something. And I hung up, and I remember I was sitting there at my computer, and it just came out of me in letter form, and it did appear in Esquire in a slightly different form, but it is what is now the invocation at the beginning of the book. And I loved writing in that direct. It just felt so, even though I was addressing everyone, it felt so intimate, and I felt so much permission to kind of mash the poetic right up against the mundane, and then they become the same thing. And I felt like I could have written that letter forever. Yeah. And then when I wrote about my father, again for Esquire, initially that started out as a letter, and I didn't know why, but I thought there was something to it. So when I was looking to write something longer, I just kept going back to the fact that those were both letters, and I thought, what if there were more letters? And then I started to play around with it, and I wrote the one to my accountant, to Abraham. And then I think I wrote, and then the one to my grandfather, the one that I've not met, didn't ever meet my grandfather, but I wrote one to him. And
it's beautiful.
And thank you. And I just had, I just felt there was so much permission there.
Yeah.
And I really need some kind of structure, and I need some sort of boundaries so that I can then break them.
Yeah.
And once I had that and it was clear, I felt like it just happily sort of came.
Yeah, I mean, they seem like they could become super addictive.
It's hard for me to write in any other form other than a letter now.
You do write good letters, though.
Thank you.
Is there something about it being a lost art these days that also you're thinking of?
Yeah, and also, so much of the book is about and for my father, and that's why there's an oyster on the cover. And he wrote incredible letters, and I included a couple of pieces of his thank you notes at the very end of the book, and he just wrote amazing letters, and I have most of them, and I got that from him, and people do appreciate them, I think.
Yeah,
I think
do.
It's a way to, someone really feels considered that you sat down and that you bothered to write it and put it on paper and mail it. There are several steps to which you have to go that make someone feel considered, and yeah.
So are you going to write?
It's romantic.
Yeah, it is. Well, I love it because it's this connection of an I and a you across time, and the you or space, usually literally,
right.
And you manage that with the letter to your grandfather. There's so much imagining in it, but it doesn't feel made up, if you know what I mean.
Right.
It feels really given, and I think the book is generous in the way that a letter can be. So.
Well, it's funny with that one too. It was a story that my dad always told about my grandfather that I loved, and something about it sort of.
It's about
it was
war.
A distillation of who he what he represented in my mind, what he must have been like. And it was about the war, and it was about my father. And I just imagined what it was like that in that moment when he sent my father a bottle of booze during the Second World War. He hollowed out a loaf of rye bread and wrapped it up like a birthday cake and sent it to him in the war. And he actually got it in the middle of a rice paddy and in the Philippines. And so I imagined, and I felt like I got to hang out with him in a way. I imagined the moment when he did that. And I sort of tied it into this moment when I was hitchhiking in my 20s, which there's not that many young people here, but you should never do that, ever. But it was much safer back then. But, and I was able to link us together somehow. And, it felt extremely permissive, and and being able to write letters to someone by way of someone else. Like I write to my son by way of the orderly in the hospital who was, the night he was born, wanted, when you have a baby, they want to take the baby to the nursery. And I did not want them to take my baby to the nursery. And I was extremely tired, but I got to write to my son by way of writing, explaining to the orderly why I was not going to give up my baby that night. And I think it takes, it manages, you can be sweet, and it manages to take some of the sticky out of the sweet when you're writing by way of someone else, maybe.
I see that.
Because there's a distance, there's when I'm speaking to the orderly, and there's a certain sort of like sense of instruction, right? As opposed to if I was just like,
don't hitchhike.
Exactly. Kids. Whereas if I was speaking directly to my son, I mean, it's tricky. It'd be trickier.
Well, you did tell an interviewer that writing letters allowed you to not say all you were thinking. So I was wondering if you still felt that way, and if so, if you could tell us what you didn't tell us. What does it allow you not to say?
I don't remember saying that.
Well, let's think of it a different way. Is there something that you don't have to do in a letter, when you're writing?
Well, I did want this also. What was hard for me was that in the end they didn't know what to call it, and they called it a memoir, and I sort of hated that. It made me cringe, and I feel like I have to apologize for it when somebody sees it. Oh, you wrote a memoir, as though it's certainly about my standing around craft service with some TV stars and whatever. And it delegitimizes in a way the writing of it, which made me unhappy. But I felt like I did set out really to write about these men, and I had fun putting myself in them in whatever context, and distancing myself from myself. But I wasn't really setting out to write about me. And that was a surprise that I was included as much as I was.
Right.
So there were things that, like, for instance, Dear Cab Driver, I'm writing his experience of that. I could write it the exact same letter and it would be completely true entirely from my point of view on the day, but I'm writing it from my point of view now. So I had to be a little bit more generous to the cab driver.
I love that one. That one's really
Thank you.
beautiful. It does do a double portrait in that one especially. And I think both of, as you said, the time that you're writing about, but then the person now writing, or the persona. And I think we get to know both in that piece. So.
Yeah, and that was a surprise to me as well, and I almost didn't want to write it. But I remembered that man, and I was just thinking in terms of apologies, and I was thinking about that moment and whether or not I was right, and I could write it and skew it in a different way so that you would have enormous sympathy for me, but I felt I did want to write an apology of some kind, but I wanted to be fair to both of us. Which is, I loved the challenge of that, because I had to be kind of strict with myself. I had to be hard on myself.
I think you were. I think it's almost like a poem in a way. and I know you have a fondness for poems. And I just love how a poem can show these different perspectives, that you have to kind of, someone said that the poem started as, the first poem was a curse and the second one was an apology or something.
Oh, wow.
And I think of that idea that, you're trying to balance that, and the lovely sort of apology that you mentioned. But were you thinking of poems at all, or?
I think I always think in terms of that. And I know when I was interviewing you about Blue Laws, which you must, even if you don't understand yet how much you love poetry, which you will after you read his book, you should really buy his book because he's a magnificent. And I don't want to embarrass you, but you don't mind if I embarrass you a little.
Embarrass me a little, yeah.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that one day I'm going to be able to call up the poet laureate and be like, "What's up?" Like you're going to answer my calls, but yeah, you are able, I feel like, to locate the reader in time very quickly and very economically. I feel like and we talked about space. I remember the last time we were talking about how and I think you were surprised how many references to space that I found in your poems.
True.
And I certainly love space, and I think there's so much poetic analogy there. And I actually have a piece, Dear NASA.
Yeah.
And I also refer to the stars in Dear Big Feet. And I think there is something about locating ourselves in the universe. And I think poems do locate you with someone else, where they bring you where that person is.
Absolutely.
And I just read this amazing thing in this Joseph Brodsky poem. This line really knocked me out. As for the stars, they are always on. That was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reason why poets turn to the heavens and the stars and the galaxies and go outside themselves to come to where we are.
Well, and you said that a little bit about the mundane and the, what did you call it? The sort of
the poetic, the lyrical, and the
yeah. The sort of extraordinary and
silly.
the ordinary, to me, that's what a poem is.
Exactly.
And it does some of what you're talking about, which is take something that seems mundane and elevate it. And also say the stars, for instance, are always on.
Right.
That there's always this majesty around us.
You do that with Ode to Okra. You do that with all your odes, I think.
Well, thank you. But we're not going to...
He's that good.
You're not going to get off that easy. I want to ask you also about sort of, what was the first letter you weren't able to write? Or that just didn't fit? Because I know you wrote more.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There were a lot. Well, I mean, it also reached the point where I was in some sort of bizarre delirium and couldn't stop. And I remember calling my editor and saying, "Don't be alarmed, but I think your inbox might be something to the effect of, 'Dear guys, I met at Benihana last night,' in about 3 minutes." And which my kids were really sad I didn't put that one in, actually. But
that was a real one.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
What happens at Benihana then?
These guys were so great. Because, you have to share a table at Benihana,
Yeah.
unless you get a private room or something. And so sometimes
Who does that?
Sometimes the serendipity of that is for a birthday party, if you have a birthday party.
Yeah. But you want the guy right there with the stranger saying inappropriate things and...
These guys were just the perfect Benihana mates.
Yeah.
They were just wonderful. And they came in and I was like, they were wearing all this jewelry and they were like tatted and they were wonderful. Anyway, so they're not in the book. But
they're in our hearts, I mean.
They certainly are. They certainly are. There was Dear Veteran, there was Dear Painter that was written about this artist, Jules Olitsky, who I loved and love. I knew him a little bit and I'm friends with his family, and I was sad that didn't make it in there, and I was actually writing it the night that I got very sick, because while I was writing the book, and I was writing it the night that I got sick and had to be taken to the hospital.
Yeesh.
And that one didn't end up, and dear veteran, dear, and there's
So
a part of me that
is there
would
going to
have.
be a postscript book, like a PS?
I mean, I feel like I would be too embarrassed to whip out more letters. I could probably do it for the rest of my life and just write that, and having, writing in a different format is challenging right now because I do miss the freedom of that. And I wish I had a structure that would allow me, that made me feel inspired in the same way.
Yeah. Is there anything you can tell us about what you're writing now, or are you writing more things of whatever, however you call them?
Well, I feel like I'm going through this thing right now where every day I'm certain of what it is, and then the next day I'm certain that it's actually something else.
That's great.
And it's a little,
You're in the zone. I mean, that's what they call it.
Really?
I haven't ever experienced it myself, but that's what I hear. They call it.
It's hard. Well, right now, part of what I'm writing is dealing with an aspect of the Korean War, and I spent the entire flight to San Francisco the other day just looking at records of people who were aboard certain ships that sailed to.
Yeah.
It's
So,
really
so do you
interesting.
do a lot of research like that usually, or?
I really enjoy it because I feel like it always opens things up. And I did it for Oyster Picker. I actually do know a fair amount about oysters now. When I was writing it, it inspired me to write so much, and so much of it is in there. And also with NASA, there were things that sparked things in me. I did have this letter for a long time that I wanted to be in the book, but most everyone hated it, except for about 3 people, called Dear Erwin Schrödinger.
With the cat
I tried so many times, but apparently it was a bit off-putting, that letter. So.
Yeah. You open the book and sometimes it's there, and then you open it sometimes.
And then sometimes it's not there.
Yeah, sorry, that's a
sometimes it's dead and poisoned.
Schrödinger joke. I want to ask you a little bit about some other projects, if that's okay.
Sure.
Last time we were talking, I was telling you that Paula Vogel had taught at Brown when I was there.
Right.
And of course wrote How I Learned to Drive, and you were in the lead when it debuted. Can you tell us a little bit about that and that experience and what that meant?
That was a really important, it was one of a handful of the most important experiences I've had acting, I think. And we might be reviving it. Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
It'd be interesting to play a part that I played 20 years ago.
Yeah. You could do it.
And I actually wasn't old enough for the part then, so she changed the line. So now she's going to have to change it in the other direction.
How interesting. I
Yeah,
love that.
it was her writing's interesting. It's very deceptive because it looks quite simple on the page, and then it has a lot of heft when you open your mouth to speak her words. I was surprised by how deeply I felt her text when I read it aloud. I couldn't tell that from looking at it on the page. A lot of times, usually I feel like I can tell, and with her I couldn't.
Huh.
Yeah.
So when did you know? Was it that?
Well, I turned it down a couple times because I just
Oh.
couldn't get it, and I wanted to do it, and I loved Paula, and it was the right time, and I loved the other actor, but I couldn't let go of it. So I asked the director, I said, could I just read it aloud? Because I wasn't sure I was the right person for it. And I asked a friend to come with me and read it, and the second sentence, I was like, my throat just felt my heart kind of pounding, and I want to do this.
Yeah. Do you feel that way about, I know you feel that way about writing because you described it, but would you ever write a play yourself, or do you have interest in that realm?
If I would be happy if one came to me. I feel like they visit. I was with James Galvin when I was in Iowa, and he said I love his poetry so much. And he said the greatest thing, I asked him if he was writing, he said, sometimes they come and they whisper in your ear.
Right.
Sometimes you listen and they're not there. And I feel like poems.
Was that a poem that
writing.
you read?
He said it to me
As a poem, basically.
as a he said that's how poems
Yeah.
arrive. And I feel like sometimes
He speaks in rhyming couplets, basically. That's what
James,
that's what I'm gathering.
I don't know, he's a cowboy and he's a poet, so he's
Yeah.
got a lot going for him as far as man goes. And if I'd known him a
Mr.
little,
Man.
he would have been in there, but yeah,
So,
it's quite attractive. But yeah. It just doesn't take more than, well, you're a poet, and so I didn't ask an actor to interview me tonight. So if that tells you anything.
but maybe you would, if it came to you, a play.
I don't know. I mean,
Do you resist it, or is it more that you feel like?
no, I don't know. I feel like some people, it comes out like that.
Yeah.
And just in the same way that I love poetry so much, it's, I'd say, the thing I'm most passionate about, and
I mean, that's just good taste. Let's feel.
but I feel I don't write the best poetry, but I
Sure.
feel like there has to be me for there to be poetry. You need someone to love it as much as I do for you to,
Yeah.
there needs to, just like I need people who love theater.
Sure.
When and people who understand it and want to go to the theater and want to appreciate it, and the audience, they're the other half of it.
Yeah.
Which is why working in front of the camera is not as fulfilling to me, and it's not as exciting, because that other half isn't there. It's not. It doesn't feel alive to me. It feels somewhat canned. There's like something metallic about the experience
Sure.
to me, whereas like theater feels alive, and even in the way that poetry does. Because I feel like I'm the other half of that
No, I mean,
poem.
I think.
But what I'm saying is I don't write great poetry, so it's like, even though I wish I did.
The thing about writing poetry at all is you don't know if it's great yet if you're writing it. When did you know you were?
I guess that's true. I mean, I think that's true of most writing, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. There's some things that I wrote and I thought, okay, that's
Yeah.
it.
You,
But I
you
never
nailed
would
it.
say that about my acting. I would never go, yeah, it was so great and this and so. I don't think I've ever said that in my life. I mean,
Yeah.
but
Did you know, say, in Angels of America, that was? I mean, surely you felt the gravitas.
I felt
of
good
it.
one day when I went home from work, a couple of days, but
Yeah.
not 100% happy with. It sounds hollow when I say it now, because people were very generous with me in
Yeah.
response to that work. But part of that is Tony Kushner, because the part is written so unbelievably well.
Right.
And sometimes I feel like you should get awards as an actor when you take something extremely marginal and you make it sound like a human being would actually talk like that. Whereas like saying Tony Kushner, it's like, you're giving me an award for that. Well, thank you, but I feel like Tony should get it.
Yeah.
In some sense, but.
But I could also almost see these on stage, sort of monologues. Did you think about the monologue form at all when you were?
People have asked me about that, but I feel like it doesn't fully make sense. I don't know how it would work. I feel like Cerberus might work alone as
Yeah.
a theater piece, because I think it's quite theatrical with the dog and everything.
Yeah. And that's about 3 or so boyfriends mixed into one 3-headed
Yeah, well,
monster.
Cerberus is the dog that guards the gates of hell, right? So I made each head a different bad relationship. Some of those heads might encapsulate more than one person. This might be more than one person
Right.
within that dog.
I mean,
But,
I think that's what's brilliant. It felt very true, but we did know it was a composite and not a completely,
Right.
As it happened story.
And in the end, that letter is a conversation with myself, and it's a conversation that
Yeah.
I'm still having. Why was I in those relationships?
Sure.
And what part of that did I provoke? And what part of that did I seek out? And what part of it, why did I allow that for so long?
Because it was Cerberus. I mean, scary,
Scary
exciting.
dog.
Yeah.
He's famous in hell. I don't know. And it took a long time for me to get to the place in my life where I could say, you can't speak to me like that anymore.
Right.
And that's very important. And so it is a letter. It sounds cliche, but it is a letter of gratitude as well.
Yeah.
And there were sweet things about all of those relationships.
No,
also.
you're exceedingly fair, I think, to them.
Thank you.
But I assume one of their heads is on your wall somewhere. One of the Cerberus.
Well, there's one somewhat mean line in that story,
Just
but
one?
I just could not take it out because it's so good. I just couldn't. Something
Okay.
about having sex with a rhinoceros. I just feel like I couldn't take it out. So
This segues perfectly into my next question.
how can that be?
It's about rhinoceri. No, it's about
Safari
love
porn.
scenes.
Oh,
I don't know how to say it, but what's harder, writing them or filming them? And I asked
I
this.
actually enjoy both.
Okay.
I do. I feel like
You write great love scenes,
Thank
just
you.
for everyone's.
Thank you.
Because they are generous and fair and full but fun, and they're just you do romance well in them.
Thank you. I am a romantic, sadly. But I remember when I was writing Dear Popeye, I didn't set out to think, well, I'm going to write something really sexy. I felt like my fingers just kind of started writing, and I didn't, and it just kept getting more and more like NC-17. It just was getting more, and it felt quite free at a certain point. It didn't feel like
Sure.
I was driving the car and trying to do it, which is the same thing when love scenes on camera or when you're acting, they can be incredibly informative about the person, right? Because how you are, how you feel about your body, how you relate to another person, how naked you're willing to be in every way says so much about you as a person. Where you don't want someone to touch you, like when you start to space out, when you start to perform, because a lot of
Sorry,
people
I should
do
be writing
that.
these down. Like
It can say so much, and the hard thing with love scenes is that so many of them, it's like, okay, now we're going to shoot the love scene, and the woman's going to look beautiful, and the man's going to be untouched. She's going to go, and it's always going to look like good sex, and that's not the most interesting way to depict it. And the scenes that I've done that were not successful were either they put corny music on top of it, and then it just looked like,
bad.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Or it was just too many camera angles and not two people sort of relating.
Connected, yeah.
But I think they're very interesting to shoot, and I do enjoy them for that reason.
I mean, I think what I read and feel like you were trying to capture some more like a Godard version of that, like sort of just there, and all the sort of silly stuff as well. I think you did a great job with that. We're rounding third, and I was wondering if you would read us a little bit more, and we might have time for one more question.
So I was going to read from the end of Dear Doctor. As I was saying before, when I was writing this book, I became very sick and I almost died. I was hospitalized for a while, twice. And this is to the doctor that saved my life. This is the end of the piece. I got to watch people trying to save a life. I felt mine pulled away and back in spurts of protest and compliance. From a completely different vantage point, I got to measure a length of mortality against that infinite question mark. Best of all, there is a small but distinct category of negative thought that I abandoned somewhere when I realized I only had the strength to hold so much and something had to go. I can't decide where existence lies or barely dangles, and doctor, maybe you don't know either, but I can tell you I am humbled by the second chance. I don't know what death is, but I am 100% clear on what it isn't. It isn't my daughter refusing to try on a pair of shoes while the salesman admonishes me for buying her the wrong insoles, and then leaving the store furious as my daughter says, I want you to know I support you 100%. Can today be the day I start on coffee? It also isn't the dog digging a pack of gum out of my purse and chewing it, then peeing on the gum wrappers and crawling in my lap, making me forget to hate her. It isn't having the door handle to my office break off in my hand when I realize my only keys are in there, and then remembering that, oh yeah, these are luxurious problems. It isn't having too much to do and wanting to scream, and it isn't screaming. It might be poetry, but it isn't sitting and hearing it read by my son. It isn't him giving a standing ovation for the actor with the smallest part, or my daughter confessing that she lied and then doing a cartwheel. It isn't Antiques Roadshow after sex for the 6th time while the sheets threaten to disintegrate. It isn't me listening to my children breathe at night and that being enough to want my heart to keep pumping blood. That one, mine, was not the only heart you saved. Sure, they may have used the loss of their mother to fuel them in life toward a greater purpose. Or maybe it would have been so damaging that they'd never fully come back. Thanks to you, I don't have to watch either of those scenarios play out while perched on a cloud fighting with God to let me intercede, or spend eternity aching to at least become the quivering sunbeam that lands on them one morning when they roll out of bed aged 25. As my friend Father Bob says, medicine can be more art than science. I believe the best doctors are a particular category of artist with the creator's instinct to throw something on a canvas and start expanding, which must come down to divinity and the ability to judge what would bleed well into what. It was too scary for me to face, my body giving me warnings of being so screamingly temporary. I wonder how often we are being nudged, but we turn away. We find a place to jettison all of it, or hand it to someone and say, here, please organize this for me, I can't stand it. It would be eerie if those warnings lingered somewhere, the sound of them. Run home. Don't answer the door. Walk away from him now. What if that lasted? If only I knew what last meant. There is no now, my father would say, banging his cane on the floor on the word now. As soon as you say the word, it's already in the past. When is it? There isn't one. This is the only moment, and it has already passed. The only things suspending time are children and cross-country travel. Not even all our stars are moving. That was light years ago. It's only us here, dying as slowly as we can.
Yeah, I'm jealous of that last line. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And I was thinking about it before we turn it over to the audience and their questions. I was thinking about this idea of the pearl, in the oyster, and then the stars. And you kind of, at the end of the book, you're kind of joining these two, I don't know, I think of it almost like as the atom and the universe. And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about Dear Oyster Picker, just real quick, what the premise of that letter is.
Well, I wrote it, there is a letter in the book, Dear Daddy, but it couldn't even scratch the surface of my relationship with my father. And someone said to me early on, I don't think you've begun to write about him for this. And I thought, I felt like my head just exploded in that moment. I just felt, what is that? There's how am I going to get to that? And his last meal, I got him oysters. I went through quite a lot to get them, but I got them. And he had them, and I still have the shells. And it's the oyster itself is an analogy. The memory of my father, that it was his last meal, and that someone pulled them out of the sea, which is something I'd never considered before, that someone did that. And then when I learned about oysters and oyster pickers, seeing what someone actually goes through to get an oyster, to pry an oyster from its oyster bed, it's quite a treacherous, it's a very difficult job. And I wanted, in earnest, to thank that person, whoever they were. And in some ways I feel like that piece, that letter, although it's not perfect and in some ways not finished, is one of the things I'm most proud of in my life for having done, period. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be finished, it's just that I wrote it, the spirit of it, and the spirit of what moves it. I'm happy that it's there and it can't be changed or polluted. I wrote it and it's mine and it's there.
It is indeed. I think it's pretty perfect, and I think everyone would agree and give you a round of applause for. So we have some audience questions, I think, coming up here. While we're waiting for that, my last quick question is just about Prince. Did you ever meet the purple one? Or?
I spent one of the greatest nights of my life at Prince's house in California.
And you say I'm wearing purple.
It was a massive Prince fan, massive. And it was the night of the Emmys, which is about to get, so don't be like, he's talking about the Emmy. Because everyone was like, I was double nominated. And as I'm walking in, someone says to me, aren't you so happy to be double nominated? And I said, no, because I'm going to lose twice, which I did. And so I was completely honored. And I'm not just saying that. Every time you're nominated, I do feel 100%. But the moment when they hold the camera on you and you're pretty sure you're going to lose is not that much fun.
But it's the actor's biggest challenge. I feel like that's the actor and scene.
Even if you win, and then it's like, I got to walk up there without my shoe falling off. I have to remember to thank people. I'm going to eat. It's, I know I'm complaining about being nominated for an Emmy, and I'm acutely aware of the irony within that. But
you're complaining about losing.
Basically.
Twice, yeah.
I'm not actually, because then I was with my friend. He and I were hanging out after I'd lost twice. And this text came through on my phone from someone who said, you've just been invited to a private party at Prince's house. And I just wanted to relive. For a second, I just thought, oh God, if there was a spaceship, I'd love to go back to that moment. But I didn't. I mean, it's not like I had to think about whether I wanted to go or not.
You got right in the Batmobile.
Cut to me, it felt as though that happened. Because I don't remember getting that. And I remember standing there, and it was about 12 people, and he's, right there where that gentleman is, and he busts out in the beginning of the Purple Rain guitar solo, and I mean. My head popped off of my body. I turned around, Michael C. Hall is standing behind me, and he goes, I'm fully convinced that none of this is actually happening. And I said, I think that maybe we are dead, actually. Maybe we died at the Emmys, and this is some version of heaven. So I feel like I know he gave so much. He really did. And he did that quite often. He would have surprise shows.
Yeah.
He loved to play so deeply that he would just for hours and just invite 10 people or show up at a club.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a pretty remarkable night.
Sounds special.
Yeah.
I saw him only twice, but that one was a giant arena, one was just a little tiny venue, not tiny, but the Fox Theater in Atlanta, which is intimate, and it looks a little like this, but on a slightly bigger scale. So.
Some of the best memories of my life are me and my friend Kay Todd Freeman dancing in the Commons Well at college to Prince, and rolling on the ground, and
we have just a few questions. One is, how did your relationship with your father and mother influence different chapters?
Well, my relationship with my father really is what fueled the writing of the book. And I think part of writing it, he died, I guess 4 years ago. And a lot of it was, when I finished Oyster Picker, I did sit and just cried for quite a long time. And because I felt like I had him back for the moment when I was writing it, and I don't know if you felt that way about your father, but because you've written so beautifully about him, and Book of Hours is just stunning
Thank you.
for me about that. And I think I always am so sensitive to other people writing about their father and their parents in general. And I kind of did win the parental lottery. My father was remarkable, and my mother is just a magnificent woman. She's really incredible, and I dedicate the book to her. And there's very little profanity there's a little bit of sex, but I did want something positive. And I think that is the best of my mother and father in me, that wanted that. It's like the woman, it's what in me wants, explains to my children why we're going to church on Sunday, or why, that is my parents in me. So.
Yeah. This is an interesting question, and I don't know if it applies exactly, but someone asked, how did you choose your pseudonyms? Do you have pseudonyms?
I do.
So tell us what they are.
Well, I can't tell them because then they won't be pseudonyms.
Okay, fair enough.
One of them was a friend of mine who's in the book, Dear Poetry Man. He's a singer, and there's a song from the 70s that I really loved, and it's a girl's name, and he used to sing it for me sometimes in concert, and he would call me that name. So that's part of it. And then oh my God, there are two people in the book. I didn't really realize that. And then the second part of the pseudonym is the middle name of my mentor, who's in the book, Dear Mentor, who died.
Acting mentor?
Director, yeah. He was a director and a friend. He died of AIDS about 20 years ago. So. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Well, I think that's one of the things that might surprise people is how much you wrestle with loss. It's not, it's really powerful, I think, how you were able to summon that up, but also keep humor. I mean, even the sort of second piece you read, there's moments of humor in it, at least.
I think there are some, the loincloth. I knew this guy when I was in the 80s when I worked at this health food store, and I only ever saw him, for the first few years that I knew him, I only ever saw him wear a loincloth. And he didn't wear anything else with the loincloth. He wore only the loincloth. And he had this crazy, incredible electric hair that made him look like he'd just been plugged into the wall. Like he was the most extraordinary creature.
Did he have a winter plan, or was that his?
Well said. He lived by the beach, so he didn't need one, really. But I did end up seeing him a couple years later, and he was wearing a jean jacket, and it was very disturbing. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, it was very
That's
thrown.
not right. You
it was
can't
very
switch.
thrown. But that piece, there's a lot of humor in that piece. It's funny, the people that end up haunting you. They're not always the people that you think. Dear Big Feet, I didn't know his name. I just saw his feet in the hospital when my father was in the hospital. And the Deer Dancer, when I was 13, the boy, or I was 15, that I saw I saw him dancing at a Yaqui Indian ceremony. Like, I just didn't know these would be the people that would haunt me, or stick with me, or that I would end up writing to.
Yeah.
I didn't plan it.
Someone asked, in fact, in here, I think you've talked about it a little bit, but is there any one person in the book that you wish you could add? I mean, you sort of talked to this a little bit, but I think it almost goes to what you're saying.
That's such a good question.
Yeah. Like that.
I do wish that I could have had more from my brothers because I love them so much. But it just felt so massive.
Yeah.
I didn't know how I could even tackle that. And so I felt like I put them in lots of different places. And I also didn't want to, they're private people, and I didn't, I didn't necessarily, I felt like they were represented enough, but in some ways I wish they each had their own tribute.
I know how you feel. Though I don't have brothers, I know how you want to get everything down, But I think the book's the better for being selective and
Really?
feeling urgent. Yeah, and I love the order of them. I mean, it reads sort of novelistic, and has this kind of arc. I mean, we're talking about very different people, but there's a portrait that's being painted. And I really like that about it. This question is about how was the transition from acting to writing? Did it feel like a transition?
It didn't, because I think, well, I've always written, so it didn't feel like it was something that I just started. I mean, I wrote for Esquire for 15 years or so, and other
How often were you writing for them?
publications. It just, whenever there were, they would call sometimes and be like, write, 100 words on gas station food in Mississippi,
Right.
or, write, like, actually that was my idea. They said write about food, and I wanted to write about food at gas stations. I don't even know.
And they
if
didn't
that
let you
actually
do
is-
that?
No, I think they did.
Okay.
Or write about having sex in public. I mean, it was Esquire, so, it's like, or what to do for Valentine's Day for your girlfriend, or
Right.
things like that. And then there were some more somewhat serious pieces, but it's very male-centric, so it would be like, what can you write about music to have sex to, and,
Yeah.
which I was happy to do. And
Yeah, I was gonna say, all
Prince
these-
was on there.
This I should be writing down.
That one, you can Google that one. But I did love writing for Esquire, and I wrote for some other publications, but as you know, like the magazines let fewer and fewer
Yeah.
pages now. Everything's going online, so that was part of my impetus to want to write a book and to have more to write, because I so love writing, and it makes me so happy. And I wasn't getting the opportunity
Yeah.
very much. And I also wanted to write a book that men would read, and it's hard to convince a man that I wrote a book that they would want to read, but most men that read
I
it
think
really
that's-
do like it.
Yeah, I wouldn't see why. All
Well,
the
it
men
starts
here are
off
buying
with
the
Dear
book.
Grandpa,
So,
and then
yeah.
Dear, so there's, you've got World War II.
No, I think
Memoir.
I'm saying I don't see why. That would stop anyone, because I think it's a beautiful book, and it feels, maybe this is obvious from what we've been talking about, but it feels super personal, but not like, naked in the. Well, maybe it does feel naked. It doesn't feel like you're just sharing everything. We know that.
It's not salacious, because
Yeah.
I didn't put anything in it.
Yeah.
I was never trying to be titillating, but there were things that I revealed that, sometimes when I wrote them initially, it felt a little bit like, oh, do I really want to? But I'm a really direct person, and I'm fairly honest and open,
Yeah.
and it just wouldn't be like me to misrepresent myself, I don't think.
Not the person I've gotten to know a little bit, but also the person you find in that book. I mean, I think you manage, I'll say it again, this sort of generosity to the others, but also to the self, like the past self that took this journey, which I think is
Oh,
really,
I like that.
it's nice. I mean, because in a way, you're writing back to that old person who was with, Cerberus, or,
That was really interesting, and I would
Yeah.
almost encourage people to do that. Like,
yeah.
if you think
Make
about somebody in
monsters
your
of
life who maybe was not good to you, or misunderstood you, or mistreated you, or for whatever reason, sitting down and writing about it in whatever context you want was really great. And I laughed so much when I wrote Cerberus. I laughed. I mean, I thought it was, I really had a good time when I was writing as well. I write it in the form of a fairy tale, so I was able to kind of, make it show some of the uglier parts without it, because in the same way that fairy tales, things are so polarized, things are so grotesque and gruesome, and
Yeah.
everyone's a monster. So I could make myself this perfect innocent heroine, almost like a cartoon of that.
Yeah.
And that was really, it was really good for me, and it made me rethink a lot. And there were moments when I was a little ashamed of things, or things that I remembered, or things that I put up with, or things that But it was good for me to sort of lay it all out and see it and sort of codify it in a way and try to put it in some kind of context in my life now. I think that was good.
All of it was good. I'm not just saying that. I really think, I hope everyone goes out. I mean, I think we're almost out of time, but I hope that everyone goes out and buys the book and enjoys the book as much as I did.
Thank
Do you want to end with anything really quick, or should we end with
do.
a round of applause, or both?
I
Let's do both.
could, if people are not napping. What? If there's anything anybody wants to read something. What should I read? Okay. I'm going to read the beginning of Oyster Picker. If I break down crying, then I'll just stop. Is that okay?
That's fine.
I'll just stop.
But
I don't think I
lift you
will. I
up,
think I'll be all right. That makes me want to cry, though. Thank you. That was really sweet. My mother would have said that. Thank you.
She said, "You're tough."
Okay, so this is to whoever that person is, and I really did envision that person. It isn't just sort of a literary device.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Dear Oyster Picker, oh, but you have no idea. Let's just say we were both in a hurry. That isn't presumptive of me. There's no way an oyster picker would survive in the Pacific Northwest if he were even a little bit slow. Most of you have been doing that hard job for years, but the men who start young become worn down while they're still pushing through their first acres of low tide. Raw oysters are not cheap, but if you trace that pearly slip back to the moment it was plucked, you'll find an underpaid someone who did the plucking. Please, though, I'm not suggesting that you work a lowly job. I just mean that you should make at least as much as a gynecologist, who spends less time than you do all hunched over and plunging into the salty depths with rubber gloves on. You probably go through 2 pairs of those gloves a week, not only to shield you from the frigid surf, but to guard against the gashes that end up on your wrists and forearms from those tongs that pry your crop from its seabed. Your back must ache from being bent over for hours while slogging through mud that can reach your knees. That tub of mollusks that will make memorable someone's first date can weigh up to 70 pounds. I suspect that costs your body a lot. I wonder if you grow tired of always wearing the sea, dragging the sound of waves to your pillow every night. You must fall there light as an astronaut once your ankles are unshackled of wet earth and seaweed. I've tried to imagine your face when I would tell your story, the one about how we never met and how I have many pieces from you collected and sorted. I picture myself walking to you at the shoreline and waiting until you see me. I play that tape over and over with no sound, our voices drowned out by the unrelenting applause of the ocean. I tell you everything too emotional and abstract to say to someone you don't know, but still you understand it. You understand all of it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.